Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the president's house, it's the people's house. In 1792, there was a public contest to come up with the design of the White House. The winning entry came from a recent Irish immigrant named James Hoban, who created an enduring symbol for America and the world.
A lot of people aren't necessarily aware of this connection, and when you discuss the fact that the architect of the White House was from County Kilkenny, there are people who express surprise, and I think that's unexpected.
Stuart McLaurin talks to historian Dr. Ed Lengel and architect Marlo Kelly about James Hoban's architectural legacy and the surprising connections between iconic buildings in Ireland and the American president's house. He also spoke with Scottish stonemason Charles Jones, who traveled to Washington to demonstrate the traditional skills used to create the White House's iconic decorative carvings more than 200 years ago.
Welcome to the 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. This episode of our podcast is about the legacy of James Hoban, the Irish architect who designed the White House and oversaw much of its construction. This month, the White House Historical Association hosted a symposium on the architectural and cultural connections between the White House and Ireland, and also the White House in the United Kingdom. And today we're excited to preview a new book about James Hoban that the association will publish. And as research for this book, our advisor to the White House Historical Association, historian Dr. Ed Lengel, traveled to Ireland to undertake historical detective work on Hoban's architectural inspirations. Thank you for joining us again on this podcast.
It's wonderful to be here, Stuart.
In Dublin, Ed met with Marlo Kelly, a practicing architect as well as a lecturer at University College Dublin. Marlo and Ed are working together to curate this volume of essays by Irish and American authors about James Hoban. We're thrilled to have Marlo here from Dublin for the symposium and for the podcast, and thank you for joining us, Marlo.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Ed, can you start by telling us a bit about your recent trip to Ireland? What was your goal there, and who did you meet to help you put James Hoban into his native context of Ireland?
I met with a couple of experts on the architectural history of Ireland and on James Hoban in particular, one of them being Merlot and the other one being Brian O'Connell, who is a noted architect and historical architect in Dublin. We traveled throughout Dublin and also into the surrounding area to get an idea, first of all, of the context of Irish architecture in the 18th century, of Irish Georgian style and then moving into the Palladian style, and then to try to ferret out those individual spots where Hoban certainly worked or where he might have worked. In this type of work, it's very important to look visually at individual sites because so much of the documentary record no longer exists. And you can, by looking at, for example, at Georgian homes and residences, looking at public buildings, but also private estates, you can see signs of Hoban's direct influence or influences on Hoban, but also more generally, what was the world in which he worked?
Marlo, James Hoban spent most of his early life learning his trade in Dublin before moving to the United States. Can you tell us about his youth and schooling and growing up in Dublin?
Yeah, he had an interesting beginning that he was born near Callan, near Dessart Court, which was a beautiful Palladian country villa. His family were tenant farmers on the land, and he trained and got an apprenticeship as a carpenter there in the estate workshops. So he would have got his training, his very early training, in County Kilkenny, where Dessart Court is located. And then at some stage, and we're not sure exactly when, he moved up to Dublin and he began training in the Dublin Society School. And I suppose what's interesting about that is the opportunity that he had coming from relatively humble origins in County Kilkenny. What was interesting, the school itself was free of no tuition fees. So they took in, it was kind of, I suppose, targeting artisans and craftsmen who had trained and teaching them how to draw. And I suppose more specifically, in 1764, a school of architectural drawing was established within the Dublin Society. The master was Thomas Ivory, who's a very interesting and influential Irish architect from Cork. In the school, I mean, there's a whole, I suppose, wealth of knowledge that Hoban would have received in his training. He received a second prize for a drawing that he did of stairs, brackets and roofs, and that kind of marked him out. He got a medal. Ivory was the master, and as the master of the school, as part of his kind of contract, he was entitled to take students on for his own benefit, for his own work. It's very likely that Hoban would have worked for Ivory on a number of projects, which we looked at when we were in Dublin.
So as he studied, what kind of architectural styles would he have seen and might have influenced his later work, and how did these styles make their way to America?
He was studying at a very, very exciting time in Dublin's architectural history. He would have come to Dublin in the 1770s, which was a period of enormous growth, particularly the following kind of couple of decades after that. The predominant style, starting with Pearse's Parliament building, was the Palladian style, which was a kind of a return to studies of classical antiquities and representing it in that way architecturally. Ed already mentioned the neoclassical style, which again we would have seen Hoban using, but also a kind of a refinement and maybe a less formal and less rigid approach to the study of classical architecture.
I did want to just dive right into that. As you know, I was in Dublin last summer as well, and we went through some of these buildings that we believe inspired the young Hoban. And that he would have worked on. Can you tell us about some of those buildings and the architectural designs or features that he may have picked up there and brought with him to the White House? I know that when we went to the old Newcomen Bank in Dublin, there was a epiphany that I had about seeing two spaces there that I think clearly inspired something in the White House. Tell us your thoughts on that.
We are to a certain degree speculating, but there is some clear evidence that Hoban worked on a number of these buildings, including the Newcomen Bank. But he wrote a letter, which I think is a really critical piece of evidence. He wrote a letter to the commissioners of Washington, kind of outlining his experience and his knowledge of craftspeople, and he claimed that he worked on the Royal Exchange, the New Bank, which is Newcomen Bank, and the Custom House, which were three really key buildings that were emerging. Newcomen Bank, because it was designed by Thomas Ivory and it was commissioned in 1778 and completed around 1781, the timing would be right, that he would have been a student for part of that construction and design. Students, again, as part of their training, they were obliged to go out and get practice in architects' firms. So even as a student, he may have worked on the Newcomen building. And it is interesting because obviously there's the oval form of the office there, which has associations. It's a very clever way of addressing this difficult corner site, and the use of oval rooms kind of allowed Ivory to skillfully manipulate the plan. But there are other buildings, I suppose, that would have been built before his time studying and that he would have been very aware of. Most notably, I suppose, Leinster House, or Kildare House as it was known. And I think if you look, I mean, the elevation, there's obvious comparisons with the central breakfront, pedimented breakfront, and the rusticated lower level. Also the window configuration.
Yes, I remember so well walking up on the front of that last summer and thinking, that's the White House. It's a story taller than we see the White House from ground level. Yeah. But you see it, and it clearly could have inspired him to
absolutely.
do
and
what
I think
he did with the White House.
That was completed in 1745, designed by Richard Castles, and that would have been a very, very significant building at the time. And there's no way he wasn't aware of it as a student. You know, he would have been studying or visiting. But to look at the plan of Leinster House is also interesting, because you have this, apart from, I suppose, the arrangement of the staircases, but you have this central axial corridor that is very reminiscent of what's happening in the White House. And you have the two columns that continue the corridor, the form of the corridor, through the entrance hall.
Well, we're talking about what would be the cross hall in the White House.
Exactly,
and, our listeners can visualize that with the long red rug that you see the president walking down frequently to the East Room for a press conference. But as I walked into Leinster House, the foyer and that cross hall were very reminiscent of the White House, the internal space, not just the external.
And the proportions, I think that's something
Yes.
that really struck me when I was walking around the White House this morning, that there is this sense, I mean, Leinster House is one example, but there are other houses outside of Dublin, and I think one that we kind of have to mention is Lucan House, which I suppose, going back to the Oval in the plan form, what Lucan House has, which is interesting, it has the Oval Room overlooking the river with 3 windows. It has 2 dummy windows that are mirrored. And I was reading a piece by Desmond Guinness where he mentions that Dolly Madison ordered 5 sets of curtains for the Oval Room, which would suggest that in the original form of the Oval Room, that there were indeed 2 dummy windows there. So things like that. Also, I suppose, the placement of that room on axis with the entrance to the rear of the building, all of those things. I mean, they're definitely kind of devices and forms that Hoban would have noticed and imitated.
Well, Ed, you saw these spaces when you were there last summer, and given your knowledge of the White House, and where did your mind's eye take you in looking at the places that may have inspired Hoban there? I know when I saw the ovals in the Newcomen Bank and knew that 3 ovals are in the primary White House of the Blue Room and the diplomatic reception room and the Yellow Oval Room on the residence level, I thought, well, that must have been his inspiration for those ovals.
I kept thinking of the intellectual and political context of the time. Of course, the movement for democracy in the Western Hemisphere in the United States and France. Many prominent Irishmen, including Hoban, were filled with admiration for this. And you can see how Hoban used a mixture of the domestic architecture and the public architecture in melding them into the White House, which of course in of itself is a remarkable building because it has all of these domestic features in terms of comfort, in terms of entertainment and design, but it also has a nobility of aspects in its facade, its porticos, and the rest, and the windows, which you can also see in Irish architecture of the time. We went, for example, to Bluecoat School, which is now the Dublin Law Society, which has a wonderful facade that's very, very similar to the White House. One of the most remarkable discoveries we made, in my mind, is we went to a place called Belcamp Hall, which is right outside Dublin. Now, we don't know that Hoban actually worked on Belcamp Hall, but he certainly would have been aware of it. It was constructed by an Irishman named Edward Newenham, who was a member of Parliament, who was a huge admirer of George Washington.
I know you, Ed. You always have to
Yes.
work George Washington into
I
a
always have.
conversation.
I keep coming back. In fact, he follows me everywhere I go. I didn't expect to find George Washington here, and there he is. But like many other owners of Irish country estates, they attempted to emulate in the 1780s the ideal of the perfect country estate and the perfect country gentleman who is also a public leader, and to try to capture that in a domestic space. So Newenham built Belcamp Hall in the 1780s, but even before he built Belcamp Hall, he constructed what's known as the first ever monument to George Washington, which is actually a neo-Gothic structure. It's a tower built in 1778. Unfortunately, much of this is in ruins now, but if you look at it, and I got to see some pictures of the inside of the design of the plasterwork, and of the tributes to Washington, to Lafayette, to Benjamin Franklin, and the way the whole inner space works, the sense that you have when you move in, that you're entering into a public space that is also a comfortable private space that's designed for bringing the public in, for bringing the democratic public in to what is also a space of power. It's also a space of government. There's an overall aesthetic that you get almost intuitively with these buildings that speaks to a sense of democracy, that speaks to the same sense you get in the White House, that the White House pulls the public in to a center of power in a way that no other building accomplishes.
Well, George Washington, of course, the first president of the United States, but also the only one of our 45 presidents who did not live in the White House Yet he selected the site, and he selected the young Irish architect James Hoban to build this White House. How did that come about, and what was the original Hoban design like, and how did Washington influence that design?
I suspect that Hoban may have been introduced to Washington originally by Edward Newenham. They also both had Masonic connections, which were very important. Hoban had come to the United States. He was working in South Carolina. He had worked originally in Philadelphia, moved to South Carolina. Washington decided to institute an open competition for the design of the White House in collaboration with Thomas Jefferson. Hoban was specifically recruited to apply for this competition, which tells me that it was not intended to be entirely random, but actually was designed in some ways to appeal to Hoban. Hoban entered the competition. He was chosen to provide the design of the White House. Now, unlike other architects such as Pierre L'Enfant, Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who also worked with Washington, who tended to have more of almost a domineering attitude, that they were the experts, that they knew what they were going to do, and that Washington should simply step out of the way. Hoban was accommodating, and I think, as Merlo pointed out, his origins as a tradesman in Ireland, his origins, he had worked as a wheelwright, he had worked as a mason at Des Art Court and others, gave him a certain flexibility of attitude that his goal was to achieve Washington's own personal vision. And for the two of them to work together using Hoban's expertise, but using Washington's own personal vision of what the White House would represent in its original design. So you can see that in the origins of the White House.
So Hoban would have been a perfect consultant in modern-day Washington, too. He's hired, and then he comes back and tells the boss what the boss wants to hear. That's a perfect Washington consultant. Yes. So there was another relationship that Washington had with Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. What's the difference between the L'Enfant-Washington relationship and the Hoban-Washington relationship?
Washington respected L'Enfant, certainly as an expert, but L'Enfant had such a grandiose vision, almost an imperial vision, of the White House and of Washington, D.C. generally, that far outstripped what Washington wanted to accomplish. Washington had certainly an idea of a certain formality, of a certain structure, of a certain integrity of the public buildings at the center of government, but his idea was not an expansive imperial one, despite his critics. L'Enfant kept pushing. He kept champing at the bit. He kept pushing his own kind of neo-imperialist view of what Washington, D.C. would be, until George Washington really couldn't take it anymore, as well as other members of what was then called the Federal City, and the designers of the Federal City simply couldn't abide L'Enfant's overbearing attitude in many respects. L'Enfant was difficult to work with. Hoban was not.
Well, we know that Hoban moved to Philadelphia in 1785 and later relocated to Charleston, South Carolina in 1787, where he opened a drawing school. How did the experiences in Philadelphia and Charleston get him on the radar of George Washington?
It gave Hoban a certain practical experience in working in public buildings, the design of the bank building in Philadelphia, as well as the Charleston County Courthouse. He had worked on a number of private buildings and estates as well. Washington took a trip to the South in Charleston in 1791, shortly before he opened the competition for the design of the White House. That was probably an opportunity to encounter Hoban personally. He had also been recommended for the quality of the buildings that he had created. Washington certainly would have seen his work at Charleston, but I think for Washington it would have been the personal touch that would have meant the most to him. You can imagine him in Charleston shaking hands with Hoban, having a chance to talk to him, getting a kind of an insider view of how Hoban worked that would have impressed him.
So, Merlo, your thoughts on why Hoban was chosen to be the architect of the White House?
Well, I think one interesting thing that came up when I was looking at that letter that he wrote was he was stressing his connection with the stonecutters. I think he described himself as being well acquainted with people in the building line in Ireland. And I think that probably was a very key aspect to his attitude to architectural work, that he was very much working with the artisans and craftsmen. And I think that's because of the background he came from. And in his letter, he mentions those three buildings, the Newcomen Bank, the Royal Exchange and Custom House. And I just think that was the world that Hoban came from, which kind of moulded him into an architect who was very connected to the building trade.
So how do you suspect the Irish architect got along with the Scottish stonemasons?
Well, that's a whole other story.
That's great. So this grand executive mansion begins to take shape in this swampy land of what we now know as Washington, D.C. And how was that design and that image initially received by Americans at the time? It was clearly a symbolic building for our new government, and did it fit American expectations for their president's house?
Washington was trying so hard to strike a happy medium between formality, strength, power, and republicanism on the other hand. There were certainly critics of the White House's design in the origin, as they call it, the executive mansion, those particularly associated with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who regarded it as being too large, too spacious, too ostentatious in some ways, even though it was well below what Pierre L'Enfant had wanted to do originally. They looked at the White House building itself, they looked at Washington's vision of how public events would be conducted within the White House, and they simply said this was too big. There were some ideas early in the 19th century even to tear the whole structure down and to rebuild it in a more subdued, more Republican style, more intimate style. But to Jefferson's credit, although when Jefferson moved into the White House in 1801, he certainly felt uncomfortable there. He left many of the rooms unused. He walked about the White House in kind of some degree of disarray in his personal clothing and offended some other individuals, representatives of the British government in particular. He nevertheless found that he was able to make shift, that he was able to adapt to it. So most of the criticism of the White House in the early days came from the Republican side, who thought it was a bit too overbearing.
So Marlo, how would this have been viewed by Europeans at the time? Would they have seen it as an American building or something more familiar to them from a European perspective? And would it have impressed them at all?
Well, I would imagine that given its kind of references that we've kind of observed in Dublin, but also in Great Britain, this, I suppose, the Palladian villa image would have been something that would have been kind of respected and admired.
It was not a Buckingham Palace. It was, I think, in some ways, a bit below expectations for the European monarchical governments at the top. But people like the Newenhams, the Edward Newenhams of the world, the country gentlemen who believed in Republican ideals, who were involved in the democratic forms of government as they were trying to build them in places like Ireland and Great Britain, had some admiration, I believe, for what the White House was intended to accomplish. It reflected in some ways the divisions in European society, that they had not reached the level of architectural accomplishment in democratic ideals that we had yet at that point.
Ed Hoban oversaw not only the construction of the White House, but he was also the American government's principal architect until 1803. So after he completed the White House and the Adams moved in 1800, what did Hoban work on at that time?
He worked on a number of buildings in the Washington, D.C. area, including St. Patrick's Church, as well as a chapel. He designed and constructed Octagon House, which was where James Madison moved after the White House was burned in 1814 by the British, so it turned out to be pretty handy from that point of view. He played a supervisory role in the construction of the Capitol building. He was very active in Washington, D.C. government. But then, of course, when the White House was burned, Hoban returned. He was brought back to supervise the reconstruction of the White House, which is very, very poignant in my mind. There were many people who argued at that time in August 1814 and afterwards. The whole building had been gutted. The walls were severely damaged from the interior. There were those who argued now's an opportunity to, again, knock the place down and move to a different style of architecture. You have to give James Madison credit and his government credit, and James Monroe as well, credit to bring Hoban back and to try to restore that vision of the building. So Hoban remained a very, very active figure in American public life.
Now, not many architects get to have a second chance at the same building. So here he is 14 years later after the White House initially opens and the first president moves in. The British have burned the house, and it takes 3 years to rebuild before Monroe moves in 1817. So what did Hoban include that second time around that he didn't do the first time?
Hoban worked on the White House the second time, and he continued to work on the White House beyond even all the way up through the presidency of Andrew Jackson. He played a fundamental role in establishing the north and the south porticos of the White House, which provide that facade with which we're so familiar today.
Ed, what do we know about Hoban's later life in Washington? He's rebuilt the White House after the British fire from 1814 to 1817. Does he have anything that is remarkable about his career here after that time?
He's very active earlier on, even before constructing the White House. He founds the first Federal Masonic Lodge in Washington, D.C., in which he remains active after 1814. He's also very active in the Catholic community, again, working on building St. Patrick's Church and the associated chapel as well. He is widely respected as an architect who's also brought to work on a number of country homes. He still maintains a very active public role.
Marlo, we honor James Hoban today as an Irish immigrant who became an American, and he designed one of the most enduring and important examples of our democracy and our government. How is he remembered and known today in Ireland, and do people know of his connection to the White House?
I would say that he is remembered in Callan, where he is from. There's a small monument to him in the main street in Callan. There's also a memorial near Desert Court, where he would have grown up. But it is, I suppose it's interesting to note that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of this connection. And obviously in my recent research, when you discussed the fact that the architect of the White House was from County Kilkenny, there are people who express surprise, and I think that's unexpected.
Well, that's one of the exciting things about this book that the two of you are working on, is that we'll publish this and offer it not just here in the United States, as we've done with all of our other books, but it will also be available in Ireland. It'll be opportunity to teach and tell these stories of James Hoban, this young Irish architect and protege of George Washington, to the people of Ireland. It's something they can be very proud of, that they can, when they see that image of the White House now, they can see the hands and the skill of a young Irishman that made that building possible, that is perhaps the most important or visible or recognized building in the world today. And so how do you think the Irish will react to that?
I think that'll be a wonderful celebration, because there has been a number of research projects happening, various people in Ireland and over in the States trying to piece together the story of his life. And I think because there are a lot of missing pieces, that's going to be really fascinating to try and kind of join up those connections. Hopefully we'll be able to tell a coherent story about his life before and after his departure for America.
I got a sense of great enthusiasm among the Irish scholarly community for this project, of many people who feel like there's so many aspects of Hoban's life and influences that we have not worked on yet.
Well, thank you, Ed and Marlo, for giving us this firsthand account of James Hoban's life and influences from his native Ireland. And I know I can't wait to read your book, and I know that our listeners will be enthusiastic about it as well. And also, thank you for helping us understand the early connections between Ireland and America that influenced the White House and other aspects of our arts, culture, and society that are still evident today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
As part of our symposium on the historic influence of the United Kingdom and Ireland on the White House, we're focusing on the Scottish stonemasons, the 7 men who came from Edinburgh from 1792 to 1800 and carved the magnificent stone facade that we see on the White House today. And we're honored that Historic Environment Scotland, which is part of the Scottish government, has sent Charles Jones, our friend Chuck, who is with us here today and has been with us here for a week, carving an actual block of stone from the quarry in Aquia, Virginia, which was the quarry for the original White House stone. And into that block, he is carving the double Scottish rose, an element that Hoban would have seen as the Irish architect and the Scottish stonemasons would have carved as part of the beautiful renderings all around the White House today. Welcome, Chuck. Glad to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, first of all, tell us, what is a stonemason? How did you become a stonemason, and what does it mean in Scotland to still be a stonemason today?
It's a privilege. It's it's often described as a dying art or a dying craft, and the opportunities to become a stonemason are so few and far between. I was lucky, I excelled in all the subjects associated like art and graphics and communication. And I was lucky in a sense, I got a placement with an architectural practice when I was in high school, and there was a stonemason working on that estate, and I got some weekend work with him, and it all just seemed to fall into place. Historic Scotland, they were called then, advertised for an apprenticeship. And when I was working for the architects, he says, if you've got a real interest in this, you should apply for it. And I did. So it all just seemed to click together, so to speak. So I was lucky in a way because, the area, nobody else was employing stonemasons. From where I live and the area in which I worked, there would be no stonemasons within a 60-mile radius. So I was really lucky, and I feel privileged to have undertook that training.
And what type of projects would stonemasons work on today in Scotland?
They do a mixture, and because of the climate in Scotland, most of the repair and conservation work happens from spring till autumn, and then the rest of the year, through the cold, dark months, we have to be flexible and we take on new build construction. So you'll find the stonemasons in Scotland do the really nice work when the weather's better. And then in the winter, we're working on, your mainstream construction like block work and general building. So we do have to be fairly flexible.
Well, tell us, before this project, did you know about the Scottish stonemasons that had come from Edinburgh to work on the White House?
I'd heard, just in various conversations over the years, that there was some Scottish connection with the White House. But, up until recently, that was all I'd heard.
Well, I suspect it's a story that's not widely known, both in Scotland and here in the United States. And we have a wonderful new book by Dr. William Seal on the Scottish stonemasons. And we're hoping that your time here with us will allow us to tell the story more about these extraordinary men who came over and who literally left their mark on the White House today. So when you went to the White House for the first time this past week, and you saw those carvings that are all around the facade of the White House that were made by your former colleagues, if you will, how'd you feel about that, and what did you think of their work?
The quality of the stonework is unbelievable, really. And as a stonemason, I've been doing stonemasonry for almost 20 years now, since my apprenticeship, and I've never ever seen that detail carved on any other building. Double Scottish rose. So it was a privilege just being there, a metre from it. I was almost touching it the other day. And the quality is unbelievable. It's really high quality stonemasonry. And if we're producing stonemasonry to this day to that level, then we're doing well. It was very impressive.
How would the tools and the way of carving be different from those stonemasons to what you use today?
We still use exactly the same tools. I believe the stonemasons here would have been using a fire sharp chisel, so there was no carbide in the tips. So they almost would have had a blacksmith working on site, constantly sharpening chisels. And a lot of stonemasons back then had two toolkits. So one kit was at the blacksmith's being sharpened, and then when they were delivered to the mason, they would swap them over. The tools are the same. Today, there's much more power tools involved, so there's pneumatics, compressed air, pneumatic chisels, but the principle is still the same of using a chisel and a force to hit that chisel, whether it be in a pneumatic gun or whether it be in your hand. The chisels and the tools, the mallets, are no different really. In shape and in form and in use, they're exactly the same. For 1,000 odd years, the tools haven't changed that much.
During your time here, you went down to Aquia, Virginia, where the quarry is located, from where the original White House stone was brought 30-some miles upriver, offloaded, and brought right here to what we know as Lafayette Square, across the street from the White House, and prepared and then put in place and carved by the Scottish stonemasons. How does the actual stone itself, the rock that's in the ground, how does it differ from what you would be familiar with in Scotland and the great old Scottish buildings are made of?
Well, having been working on the stone for almost 4 or 5 days now, it is no different. I've worked stone very similar, so I'm sure when the Scots came over and they seen the stone for the first time and got to work with it, there was probably some relief amongst the men that it was something that was quite similar to back home. That there was possibly an element of unknown when they were travelling over here, that they didn't quite know what the stone was and how, was it going to be a soft stone or a hard stone? So it's certainly the stone today. It's a really nice stone to work. It's slightly grainier than most of the stones I've worked, but it takes a really nice detail, and that's the good thing about a stone. A good quality stone takes a nice sharp edge, and it's not too coarse, it's not too fine, and it's a lovely stone to work. Lovely stone.
You mentioned the double Scottish rose is what you've been carving this week, actually, and we're very excited about the product of that work. It's actually in two large places above the north door of the White House, but an element of it is carved all the way around. I call it the Scots wink that they have left here for us now. Have you ever seen that particular image before, the double Scottish rose?
I've never seen it until I got to the White House this week. Never seen it before on any building. And I've seen a lot of buildings in 20 years of working on them. Never seen that detail before anywhere. It's unbelievable.
What do you think about that? Do you think that that was something they came up with themselves? Or if you've not seen it in Scotland, it wasn't something that they brought with them and deployed here. Any ideas about why they may have chosen that?
Well, the stonemasons were from Edinburgh, and that's the capital city of Scotland. So if something was happening, something became fashionable of a time period, Edinburgh is where it starts and then it rolls out from there. So those guys, those masons were actually in the heart of Scotland, and fashionable items and imagery, and even the rose would have been propagated round about that time. And it's news and word travels fast. We're a fairly small country, so I'm sure the masons at that time, it was a popular image, and I would imagine they were quite proud of the fact that it was propagated, and I'm sure they just brought that with them.
You've been working on the White House grounds this week in the pony shed just south of the west wing of the White House, actually, not a stone's throw from the Oval Office where the president is working. What's that been like?
It's unbelievable, really. We're walking about and the president comes in the helicopter, the Secret Service is walking about. I'm almost on named terms with the Secret Service now down in that area. It's an honour and a privilege being here, and I thank all the guys that were involved in getting me working on site, because we're working the detail, we're working off images, and we just say, let's go and have a look at it, and we just wander up to the front door of the White House, go up, have a look at the rose, and then we go back down, carve a little more detail, I still can't quite believe that I'm here doing this.
Well, we have a wonderful partnership here at the White House Historical Association with our friends at the National Park Service. And they've been your colleagues this past week, Dale and Moss, that have been working with you on this carving. What is their work like? Have you learned something from each other in this process?
Yeah, we have. And, myself and Dale have actually been physically working the stone. Moss has been there as organising the logistics and stuff like that and offering advice and help as and when we need it. But, stonemasons, I would be tempted to say that in this day and age, there aren't many stonemasons who would call themselves master masons. There isn't that much stonemasonry construction and new build going on that a stonemason would call themselves a master. Somebody may call them a master because they're very knowledgeable, but very few stonemasons would title themselves a master. And, we believe that we're always learning, that there's elements of stonemasonry that I've never had the opportunity to do. Some of the geometry and the shapes that are involved. Stonemasons, we share ideas, because it's one stone. It's almost 24 inches square, 20 inches square. Two people working on that. It's quite close. And, whenever I make a decision on the stone, I run it by Dale. And similarly, Dale does the same with me. And, stonemasons have done that throughout history, and we still do it today.
You and I had the opportunity to actually go inside the White House as well and walk around in these spaces where American presidents have walked, and leaders from around the world have been greeted by our American presidents. What were your impressions of the White House and being in that same space as these great world leaders?
It's a fantastic building, and I'm sure many people have said it seems smaller. Although the rooms are quite large and grand, it is a fairly small building, when you consider a residence like Buckingham Palace, which is huge. It is for a family to stay in nonetheless, whereas the White House, it is smaller. If you describe the White House to somebody, you have a picture in your head of how big it might be on the inside. But it is smaller, but it's a lovely space. Lots of nice architectural details internally as well as externally. So I feel quite privileged to have wandered around with yourself in that building.
Just feet from where we are now at the White House Historical Association is Lafayette Square, right across the street from the White House, and that's where the original stonemasons worked 210 or so years ago. You've been here this week, and you see that space where they worked, and you see the results of their work. What's your connectivity felt like with them? Do you have any common sense of purpose and mission? And you are all great craftsmen in your trade, and you've worked in some measure on and around this same building. Do you have a pride of connectivity with these forefathers, if you will?
We do. When we're working on these sites and you get moments to yourself when you're on your break or your lunch or you're even walking there, you're imagining the site being constructed. There would have been almost like a small village here camped up for a few years. And I'm sure people lived and worked and there was relationships formed. It would have been a bustling little town, almost like a village, just right in front of the White House. And, as a stonemason, we get lots of periods of weeks and months of working on these buildings, sometimes working alone, and your imagination runs wild, and you do feel quite proud that you're there. And a stonemason, not too dissimilar to yourself, was there 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and they were doing exactly the same work. And it's just the amazing part of being a stonemason that you can relate to that, and it's following in the footsteps of great men.
We know that some of the Scottish stonemasons who came over to build the White House initially returned to Edinburgh, and in Newtown actually worked on homes there. And in our conversations with the Scottish government and Fiona Hislop, the Cultural Affairs Minister, we understand that plaques are now going to be placed on some of these buildings in Newtown to say that the great stonemasons of Edinburgh who came to Washington and worked on the White House worked on this building. And we're excited to go there this coming year and to see those plaques and to honor the work of those who came and worked on the White House, and look forward to seeing you there on that occasion as well, and to commemorate not just those 7 men, but the craft that you have represented so well on behalf of Scotland and being here with us. So thank you very much for your time here at the symposium and this podcast, and we look forward to sharing this great story of the Scottish stonemasons with our listeners.
Thanks, Stuart.
And if you'd like to learn more about James Hoban, White House history, or listen to more of the 1600 sessions, you can visit us anytime at our website, whitehousehistory.org.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And you can help others find this podcast by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again to Dr. Ed Lengel, Marlo Kelly, and Charles Jones. And thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.